Hey everyone, tonight we're slipping quietly into the past, wandering the worn, cobbled streets of ancient Rome, where strange and often grueling jobs kept the mighty empire ticking. But here's the twist. What if you had to do one of those jobs today? And not for gold or glory, but for minimum wage. We'll pass through marble forums and candlelit taverns, drifting into the lives of workers whose tasks ranged from the oddly specific to the downright miserable. Snail dye collectors, public bath attendants, goose guardians, and even sewer cleaners. These roles were essential to Roman life, but they were thankless, dirty, and rarely seen. So tonight, imagine yourself in their sandals. Would you show up for work if the empire paid you modern minimum wage? Before we begin, if you enjoy this kind of quiet dive into the stranger corners of history, feel free to like and subscribe, only if it feels right. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far our little bedtime crew reaches. And tomorrow, drop by and tell me which moment lulled you to sleep. Now, dim your lights, maybe let a soft fan hum in the background, and get comfortable. Let's begin our slow descent into the working world of ancient Rome. Chapter 1: Guardians of Filth. In the sprawling heart of ancient Rome, where marble facades gleamed in the morning sun and the clamor of merchants echoed off colonnades, there existed an underbelly of labor so routine and odor-choked that it passed almost entirely unnoticed. These were the guardians of filth, the men and women whose days began long before dawn and whose labor marked the unceasing rhythm of a metropolis of over 1 million souls. Each morning, as the first pale light crept across Rome's terracotta roofs, they, stirred from half-sleep, pulled ragged tunics over their shoulders, and set out along familiar paths. The day's work lay below the city's surface and upon its narrow streets. A slow, methodical battle against the relentless production of human and household waste. No trumpets heralded their departure. No banners proclaimed their importance. Yet without their steady toil, Rome itself might have choked on its own refuse. Their first destination was often the great sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, a vast network of tunnels hewn from stone and brick, dimly lit by oil lamps affixed to damp walls. Descending iron-ridden steps, the cleaners inched into the gloom, their baskets and wooden scoops at the ready. The air was thick with a melange of ancient sewage and stagnant water, a heady perfume that clung to hair and skin. They moved as if in a trance, each gesture practiced. Scoop, lift, heave, drop. The process was hypnotic. Bent backs and outstretched arms repeating the same motions until arms ached and spines protested. Conversations were murmured, voices muffled against the roar of distant water. They spoke of childhood memories a village away, of the quality of last night's bread, of the price of wine at the taverns near the forum. Such talks served as a gentle distraction, cushioning minds from the immediate reality of damp walls and slippery stones. Day after day, they cleared out stones, rags, and the half-formed remnants of meals, depositing them into waiting carts above. With each load hauled up the steps, Rome breathed a little easier, though none of its citizens paused to acknowledge the cascade of filth vanishing behind closed tunnel mouths. Meanwhile, above ground, a parallel procession wended its way through the city's labyrinth of alleys. Night soil carters, identifiable by the leather flasks and wooden barrels they bore, collected waste from public latrines and private homes alike. These individuals had entered into a peculiar arrangement under the reign of Emperor Vespasian, whose invention of the urine tax transformed human excrement into a source of revenue and industrial raw material. The carters understood that urine, left to ferment, yielded ammonia indispensable in tanning hides and laundering garments. Thus, with measured precision, they traipsed through back streets, pausing at latrines whose benches and troughs emanated pungent vapors. Each flask was sealed with a simple cork or wooden stopper, then strapped to the carter's back or loaded onto a rickety two-wheeled cart. The journey progressed at an unhurried pace, calculated to minimize sloshing yet maximize distance covered before the next stop. Along the way, the soft click of lids and the dull thud of carts on cobblestones accompanied them like a metronome. Vendors at food stalls watched with disdain as the carters passed, aware that the faint tang of ammonia clung to the air long after they had disappeared around the corner. The carters' route remained largely unaltered through the seasons, save for the brief interruptions of flooding or drought. In winter, when rainstorms swelled the Tiber and its tributaries, narrow streets became quagmires of mud and detritus, slowing the procession to a near crawl. Frozen ground in the early months made latrine entry more arduous, as hardened excrement required extra chiseling before it could be stowed away. Yet the carters persevered, for their contracts with tannery owners and fullers' guilds demanded prompt, uninterrupted supply. Come summer, the dust that rose from parched roadways mixed with the ever-present aroma of waste, creating a dusty haze tinged with sharp ammonia. It settled into every crevice of the wooden barrels, was absorbed by the leather flasks, and lingered on every tunic and sandal. In each season, the carters adapted, laying down straw on muddy paths in winter, raising covers to shield their flasks from scorching sun in summer. Regardless of weather, their route led them always past the same grim landmarks: the abandoned amphitheater on the edge of the Subura, the crumbling shrine to a minor deity outside the Servian wall, and the silent, moss-covered arches of aqueduct remains. Their work, like the city's heartbeat, was constant. Not far from the woven paths of the carters, within the stone-paved confines of public latrines, a third group of guardians performed their role. Known in hushed tones as sterquiliniarii, these latrine sweepers wielded brushes fashioned from twigs or pieces of leather. Their task: to scour the benches of the latrines, ensuring that each latrine seat stood ready for the next user. The latrines, communal in nature, featured long benches with regularly spaced openings, beneath which water from nearby aqueducts trickled continuously. The sweepers knelt or bent low, sliding their tools under each opening, lifting away the fresh deposit, and then plunging the brush into the water channel to cleanse it. Their arms moved in slow, circular motions, a ritual repeated with such precision that it resembled a dance, or perhaps a slow-motion performance in a dank theater. Occasionally, a patron offered a few coins or a piece of bread in thanks, but more often, the sweepers labored in near silence, their presence acknowledged only by the faint whisper of brushed stone and the soft gurgle of water. Their daily routine began with the lighting of 3 clay lamps, positioned at intervals along the latrine wall. The soft glow illuminated the bench's length, revealing the pale patterns of lichen and mineral stains that accumulated over weeks. The sweepers moved in pairs, one bringing fresh water in a small bucket to rinse the channels, the other wielding the brush. When a bucket ran dry, the helper trudged to a nearby stopcock to refill it, returning with water trickling down his forearms. Then the roles reversed, ensuring that no one individual bore the full burden of carrying water. The sweeper's cloth wrappings, simple strips of linen tied at the wrist, protected their hands from direct contact with the waste and were laundered weekly in the bathhouses when time permitted. Yet even laundered, they retained a faint, stubborn odor that melded with the scent of olives and heated stone. Their wages were meager, but they took solace in the rhythm of their work and the certainty that each sweep brought order to chaos. Along the banks of the Tiber, yet another cadre of workers emerged at dusk, Refused boatmen loaded their broad-bottomed vessels with baskets and barrels of collected waste, destined for disposal downstream. By late afternoon, once the sun began its descent and the day's commerce slowed, they maneuvered their boats into position, the rhythmic lapping of water against hull mingling with the distant calls of street vendors gathering their wares. Each barge was steered by one or two men, poles in hand, guiding the craft with careful pushes against the riverbed. An ill-placed thrust or a hurried turn could spill their cargo into the water before they reached the dumping grounds. A mishap that was as humiliating as it was foul. As they drifted downriver, the boatmen maintained slow, steady strokes, their silhouettes framed by the dim glow of torches flickering along the banks. They passed beneath bridges weary with age and grand arches that marked the extents of past imperial expansions, all while clutching their polluting cargo in mute solidarity. Upon arriving at the designated disposal point, often a silt bank several miles downstream, they tipped their baskets and barrels into the river. The contents rose briefly in a murky swirl before sinking back into the depths. The men watched until the surface regained its usual muddied stillness, ensuring that nothing clung to the sides of the barge. Then, poles at the ready, they navigated back to the city, their progress by starlight marked only by the faint creaking of oak and the gentle sigh of water. The return journey was silent save for the ever-present odor. But each man walked the deck with the same assured steps, for he had made this passage countless times before. Beneath these distinct yet overlapping roles, an unspoken solidarity bound the guardians of Filth. Though they seldom shared the same workspace, their schedules and pathways intersected. A Cloacarius emerging from the sewers might pass a Sterquiliniarius on the street above, and they would exchange polite nods before resuming their separate tasks. A night soil carter, pausing to rest his barrels, might glimpse a boatman returning from the river and offer a brief greeting. There, conversations, when they occurred, spun out slowly, drifting from one topic to another as seamlessly as water finding its level. Some spoke of the occasional collapse of a tunnel archway, of the trembling anticipation before a flood, or of the day a particularly solid piece of debris demanded extra labor to pry free. Others recalled childhood anecdotes. Playful scuffles by the riverbank, games played amidst the arches of uncompleted aqueducts, or taste tests of cheap bread baked by small roadside ovens. These stories, though trivial, gave shape to their days, reminding them that beyond the odors and the backbreaking labor, there existed a world of simple pleasures and small comforts. As the sun climbed and dipped, the guardians punctuated their labors with brief pauses. Cloaca cleaners retreated to small niches cut into the tunnel walls to share scraps of bread and hard cheese. Carters leaned against their carts, sipping watered wine from wooden bowls borrowed from nearby taverns. Latrine sweepers spread cloth wrappings on sun-warmed stones to dry, then wrapped them again and resumed their scraping. Boatmen beached their barges on muddy shores to snack on olives or fish. Snares, these interludes, carried out without haste, stretched time into elongated moments of reprieve. And yet, when their simple meals were consumed, each returned to the unchanging tasks before him or her. The sun might shift across the sky, painting the city in different hues, but the methods and motions remained the same. In reflecting upon the lives of the guardians of Filth, one discerns a profound lesson in endurance and unglamorous service. They labored without public accolade, their faces and names forgotten as quickly as footprints in soft earth. Their tools were crude, wooden scoops, leather flasks, twig brushes, but they wielded them with quiet expertise. They braved hazards of disease, tetanus, and collapse, often without any prospect of medical care beyond shared home remedies. And yet they persisted, day after day, season after season, weaving the refrain of their toil into the greater symphony of Rome's grandeur. For every triumph celebrated in marble and bronze, there existed 1,000 mundane victories against rot and decay, each earned by these unassuming figures. As you allow these details to settle like silt in a river, imagine the faint echo of water dripping in distant tunnels, the muffled scrape of a broom, the creak of a barge under starlit skies. These are the lullabies of labor, each repetition a gentle invitation to drift off. Know that, beneath the splendors of temples and the triumphs of legions, the steady hands of the guardians of filth ensured that Rome could breathe, could pulse with life, and could endure through centuries. And now, as your eyelids grow heavy, let the rhythmic cadence of their unremarkable yet indispensable work guide you into restful slumber, assured that every sweep, scoop, and dip carries you further from wakefulness and deeper into the peaceful embrace of sleep. Chapter 2: Masters of Aroma and Ailment. In the intertwined alleys and grand avenues of ancient Rome, where triumphal arches loomed overhead and merchants hawked exotic spices, there existed a quieter world of scents and salves. While some Romans reveled in the grandeur of public spectacles and the roar of gladiators, others devoted their days to subtler arts. The extraction of fragrant oils, the measured blending of herbal pastes, and the careful application of pungent remedies. These masters of aroma and ailment moved at a deliberate pace, their routines marked by slow, practiced gestures repeated beneath low-ceilinged workshops and within the steamy halls of bathhouses. Their labor was neither celebrated with fanfare nor immortalized in marble. It unfolded in hushed tones and among the faint hiss of heating oils, carrying with it the promise of relief from maladies and the faintest trace of luxury. Each morning, before the city's populace had even roused itself, the imperial unguentarii, perfumers whose creations adorned the cheeks and garments of Rome's elite, lit small hearth fires in enclosed rooms lined with clay jars. These chambers, fitted with low benches, smelled of damp earth, rose petals, and resinous incense. The perfumers arrived, carrying burlap sacks of dried petals, scaly lumps of myrrh, and brittle shards of frankincense. They set each ingredient before themselves on wooden planks, their motions slow and unhurried as they weighed fragments on simple bronze scales. The day's work unfolded in a sequence, crushing petals with a small, rounded stone, layering them with coarse sea salt, then transferring the mixture to a shallow copper basin. Over low flames, the perfumer gently heated water in a clay pot, then placed the basin atop it, watching as delicate vapors began to rise. With each swirl of steam, they adjusted the heat, keeping it just below the point of boiling. The room filled with a faint, steady hiss, and the perfumers leaned in to inhale, ensuring that each batch carried the proper balance of floral and resinous notes. Their concentration was absolute, their hands rarely faltering as they repeated these steps until dozens of amphorae stood ready, each sealed with wax and awaiting transport to the emperor's chambers or the villas of wealthy merchants. Not all fragrance producers worked within the perfumers' workshops. In the sprawling public baths, the Frigidaria, Tepidaria, and Caldaria, another group of laborers moved among the marble columns, dispensing aromatic oils to patrons seeking respite in the warm, steamy air. These fragrance attendants carried small amphorae of scented oils, rose, lavender, and occasionally the rare cedarwood, cradled in padded baskets strapped to their shoulders. They followed a deliberate circuit, first through the frigidarium, where they offered a faint spritz of cologne to noses acclimatized to cool stone. Then into the tepidarium, pausing by each reclining bath goer to dip their fingers into the oil and gently rub it into the flesh. The motions were languid and repetitive. Scoop, inhale, apply, move to the next client. Their tunics rustled softly against mosaic floors, and the attendants spoke in low, courteous tones, reminding bathers to breathe deeply and relax. Each amphora held only enough oil for a few applications before the attendant would refill at a central reservoir. That reservoir, fed by aqueduct chilled water and infused with herbs, bubbled quietly in a corner of the bath complex, its surface rippling like a placid pond. The attendants replenished their supplies with systematic precision. Measure exactly 2 spoonfuls of oil, stir 3 times clockwise, dip cloth strips, and return to the circuit. Over days and weeks, the repetition honed their muscles and steadied their nerves, even as the heady scents of jasmine and myrrh clung to their skin long after the patrons had departed. Within the same complex, though in adjacent chambers, another cadre of workers plied a different form of balm. The medical emollient appliers. These balnearii medicinals, as some referred to them in practice, catered to patients who sought relief from sprains, bruises, and persistent aches. They wore plain tunics, often white or undyed linen, and carried small, shallow bowls filled with thick, yellow-tinged ointments. The salves, prepared by separate apothecaries, contained mixtures of beeswax, olive oil, and crushed herbs known for their soothing properties. The appliers followed a measured routine, entering each chamber only after confirming with the medicus that the patient was ready, then using wooden spatulas, flattened and smooth, to scoop out a precise amount of paste. Their hands moved in circular, unhurried strokes, spreading the emollient from the patient's shoulder to elbow or from ankle to knee, depending on the prescription. The room hummed with the muffled crackle of oil lamps and the patient's soft sighs as cool ointment met warm flesh. The appliers never hurried, knowing that swift motions annoyed the skin and risked uneven distribution. Each motion concluded with a gentle pat, and then the next portion of skin received the same care. After each session, the balnearius carefully cleaned the spatula with linen cloths and dipped them into a small pot of wine vinegar, believed to disinfect the wood. Then he returned the spatula to its rack and fetched another for the next patient. This cycle of apply, clean, rest repeated until the appointed hour ended and the chamber was lit only by trailing torches, flickering like the final breaths of a candle. Beyond the city's walls and in the more secluded suburbs, the laborious task of gathering herbs for curative remedies occupied another set of hands. These herb gatherers, rumored, though often exaggerated, in the writings of Pliny the Elder, ventured into groves of oak and ash, along riverbanks thick with nettles, and across meadows strewn with blooms of yarrow and poppy. Each morning, as pale light filtered through the trees, they set forth with leather satchels and simple pruning hooks. There, sandals padded to muffle sound. The air was cool and damp, oscillating between the earthy musk of fallen leaves and the sharp tang of dew-soaked grasses. With meticulous care, they plucked leaves and petals, cutting only the youngest shoots or the innermost buds. They understood that the potency of a herb resided in its early stages, when alkaloids and essential oils packed the greatest punch. By day's end, their satchels bulged with carefully bundled bunches of plants. 3 sprigs of rue, for leaves of common mallow, exactly 12 stems of marshmallow. The gatherers counted each portion aloud, again and again, to ensure consistency. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, until their voices blended with the rustling canopy overhead. Once their bundles were secured with twine, they turned for home, their backs heavy with the day's harvest and their forearms sticky with the plant sap that oozed from cut stalks. Upon returning to the city's outskirts, the herb gatherers delivered their collections to apothecaries who occupied small shops near the Forum Boreum. There, in air thick with the scent of dried roots and ground minerals, the apothecaries sorted the fresh herbs into clay jars, layering them with powdered salts or storing them in wine-soaked amphorae for maceration. Some herbs were destined for inclusion in medicinal oils, others for decoctions to be boiled and strained. The apothecaries, moved with measured calm, their fingers stained green or brown from daily handling of foliage, they repeated the same movements as their suppliers. A cut here, a bundle there, a handful of leaves weighed and recorded in a leather-bound ledger. The ledger itself bore the marks of time. Its pages dog-eared, the ink faded to a soft chestnut hue. Line after line of entries traced the flow of ingredients through the city. Who had supplied them, what quantities, to which patients or medici. The repetition of these records mirrored the repetition of trades in the workshops and bathhouses above. Back in the imperial districts, the unguentarii refined their craft through incremental improvements. Each morning's test batch would yield notes, too strong, too weak, missing a citrus undertone, and the perfumer would record these observations in a small notebook. This record-keeping, painstaking and unending, formed a ledger of sensory experiments. Rose batch, day 12, more salt, less heat. Myrrh infusion, day 7, increased soak time by half an hour. Cedarwood trial, note increased resin. Content, reduced by 2 drams. The notebook's pages, yellowed and brittle, bore smudges where fingers had lingered too long over a particularly aromatic paragraph. Yet for all the intricacy of their craft, the perfumers returned each day to the same basic cycle. Weigh, crush, heat, distill, record. No triumphal choruses marked the unveiling of a perfected fragrance. That moment came quietly, when a noblewoman paused mid-conversation to inhale, nodded her approval, and allowed the perfumer a brief, modest bow. In one dimly lit workshop, the perfumer Gaius Junonius, who had served 3 successive emperors, awoke each dawn to the same sensations: the sharp clack of mortar against pestle, the smoky curl of oil lamp flames, the gentle clink of amphorae lids as they were sealed in neat rows. His apprentices moved alongside him like shadows, completing each step under his watchful eye, filling earthenware retorts with distilled water, slipping small bundles of herbs into the retort necks, then tilting them over heated sand baths. The repetition lulled Gaius into a trance of sorts, a serene focus unmarred by any sense of hurry. He rarely spoke above a sigh, content to let the recorded notes and the perfumes emerging from copper pipes provide the only commentary on his progress. Meanwhile, in the bathhouses, the fragrance attendants repeated their circuit from morning through midday, from midday through dusk, their feet tracing the same paths over and over. When a guest lingered too long in the tepidarium, the attendant would step into the warm haze, dip a finger into the scented oil, and guide the guest's arm toward the prepared bench for application. The attendant's motions never varied. They always began at the wrist, then moved 3 times around the forearm, before shifting to the elbow in 2 smooth passes. When the amphora grew light, the attendant returned to the reservoir, measured out exactly 3 ladlefuls of oil, and resumed the route, ensuring that each patron received precisely the same measure. The day ended only when the last guest departed, at which point the attendants knelt to scoop residual oil from the reservoir, poured it into a small amphora, and carried it back to the storeroom in silence. Later, when the balnearii medicinals had concluded their own appointments, they would gather in a corner chamber to clean their tools. Each spatula, after its final application of day, was submerged in a basin of soapy water and scrubbed with fine sand. Then it was dipped in vinegar, wiped dry, and placed on a rack to await the next dawn. The appliers' tunics, once soiled with herbal paste, were hung to air on nail hooks outside the infirmary door, flapping in the evening breeze like pale flags. The benches were wiped down, the clay lamps extinguished, and the chamber door latched. The remnants of ointment congealed in shallow bowls, ready to be reheated at first light, and the appliers drifted homeward, their hands still scented faintly with thyme and rose. By twilight, the herb-gatherers returned to their modest quarters on the edge of the city, their satchels empty and their sawls worn thin. They laid out the day's record: a handful of dried petals, a small pouch of crushed roots, on narrow tables, then ground them further into powders with heavy, round stones. Each press and roll echoed in the quiet room as though mimicking the martell of distant miles, and with each repetition, their minds lulled further toward indolence. They tied the final powders into scented packets, labeled them with neat, looping script, and packed them for delivery to the apothecaries at dawn. Then they sank onto straw-stuffed mats, exhaustion overtaking them as surely as night follows day. In the overlap of these various trades, perfumers, fragrance attendants, medical appliers, and herb gatherers, one discerns a tapestry of monotonous precision. Each artisan and laborer moved through a prescribed sequence of actions, their rituals passed down through apprenticeships and bound in the unspoken code of craft. The fragrance that bloomed in perfumers' jars had its echo in the colognes dispersed through baths, the soothing pastes smeared in infirmaries derived from the same roots and petals collected at dawn. And though their environments differed, from the hush of underground chambers to the steam-heavy halls of tepidaria, each worker found comfort in the constancy of their daily rites. As you drift on the slow current of these accounts, let the measured click of scales, the hiss of heated oils, the soft scrape of spatulas, and the gentle rustle of gathered leaves weave together into a drowsy lullaby. Imagine the perfumer leaning over a smoking basin, inhaling deeply as amber vapors curl upward. Picture the attendant kneeling beside a marble bench, trailing scented oil over willing skin. See the applier's hand moving in practiced circles across weary muscles. Sense the herb gatherer's patient count. 1, 2, 3, as twilight gathers overhead. In this world of scent and salve, the everyday transforms into a gentle, unending rhythm, each repetition a step further into repose. May the cadence of their labor guide you toward restful slumber, assured that in the quiet depths of Rome's back alleys and secluded groves, these masters of aroma and ailment continue their serene work, night and day, so that even the grandest city might find its balm. Chapter 3: Ritualists of the Unseen. In the hush before dawn, when the city of Rome stirred with a half-awakened breath and the first birds flitted through the empty plazas, there walked a distinct cast of individuals whose days were not defined by commerce, construction, or sanitation, but by the subtle dances of divination and the quiet rituals of religion. These were the ritualists of the unseen, men known as haruspices, augurs, festal procession organizers, and sacrificial knife sharpeners. They devoted themselves to interpreting signs hidden in the everyday world. The mottled texture of a sheep's liver, the flight of birds against a pale sky, the precise count of torches carried in solemn processions, and the steady voice of a whetstone on iron. Their work was neither heralded with trumpets nor etched in enduring stone, yet it formed the hidden scaffolding of Roman public life, offering reassurance that the gods approved each civic venture. Their repeated motions and hushed practices wove an unbroken tapestry of custom, each thread a whispered confirmation that Rome stood under divine favor. The haruspices woke before the first glimmers of light, for their sacred art demanded uninterrupted focus. Clad in simple robes of undyed wool, They carried small leather satchels containing suspended bronze mirrors and votive tablets. Their day began as they approached a modest tent pitched on the outskirts of the city, where a pair of white sheep awaited inspection. The gentle creatures, chosen for their pristine hides and clear eyes, stood tethered to low posts, their breath visible in the chilled morning air. With painstaking care, the chief Haruspex knelt before the first animal, raised his mirror and lantern, and observed the faint shimmer of viscera through the skin. An omen visible only to those trained through years of apprenticeship. After murmuring a brief prayer to Jupiter and offering a ritual pinch of incense, he made the precise incision, releasing a soft hiss of steam and blood. The others stood by silently, their shadows lengthening as they shone lantern light onto the exposed liver. The Haruspex traced patterns with a thin stick, a faint groove on the lobe here, a small blemish on the gall there, and recorded each detail on a wooden tablet. Each scratch in the wood held meaning. A tiny cavity suggested turmoil to come, a smooth surface promised prosperity, and clusters of nodules foretold festivity or war, depending on their orientation. The tablet was set aside, and the process repeated with the second sheep. When both examinations concluded, the haruspices withdrew beneath the tent cloth, leaving the sheep in the cold dawn light, and whispered among themselves. Their voices were low, yet distinct. Careful confirmations, slight disagreements, and finally consensus. They noted the ambient temperature, the direction of the wind, and the condition of their lamps, for these two formed part of the interpretive matrix. Only then did they file from the tent, their robes dusted with fine particles of incense ash, and delivered the verdict to the presiding magistrate. The record, smudged in places by quick fingers, traveled into the Senate's archives, where it was consulted before any major public decision. Across the city, on the gentle slope of the Palatine Hill, stood another figure of quiet import, the augur. While the Haruspex consulted the entrails of beasts, the augur studied the skies. He woke as well at first light, but his tools were nothing more than a low wooden platform called a criterium, several marked poles driven into the ground, and an open view of the eastern horizon. The augur entered his templum, a sacred, cordoned space demarcated by ritual plowing, and stood upon the platform, eyes fixed on the heavens. His attendant recorded the time on a small notched stick, then waited. Flocks of birds soon appeared, circling the distant hills before sweeping across city rooftops. The augur raised his staff horizontally. Each flap of a wing, each scatter of feathers, fell into place within a predefined grid. A cluster of crows beyond the northern pole might signify impending conflict. A solitary hawk soaring above the southern mark could promise abundant harvests. A random scattering of sparrows to the west carried murkier implication, left to the augur's seasoned judgment. He repeated his observations 5 times, each cycle lasting as long as it took for a fresh wave of birds to assemble. The ritual unfolded with deliberate pacing, avoiding any haste that might disturb the birds themselves or corrupt the reading. When the final bird settled beyond the rightmost pole, the augur set aside his staff, bowed his head in silent prayer to Mars and Minerva, and offered a pinch of sacred salt to the wind. Only then did he emerge from the templum to deliver his report. A structured account of wingbeat counts, directional deviations, and the significance attached to each cluster. The report was transmitted to the Senate or to the magistrate overseeing a proposed construction or military enterprise, determining whether the auspices permitted action or demanded delay. In the heart of the city, as the augur and Haruspex practiced their measured arts, another group toiled to ensure Rome's religious calendar advanced without mishap. Festal procession organizers, though rarely named in the official histories, carried a ledger of events that could not deviate. Their day began with the careful review of scrolls listing upcoming festivities. The parentalia for ancestral commemoration, the lupercalia to cleanse the city, the quirinalia to honor Quirinus, and many others. Into a low, windowless office they brought wax tablets and bone styluses, and before a small shrine to Vesta they laid out red and black pigments. The first act was always to confirm the date by the sundial outside. Shadow lengths and angles recorded in fine red strokes. Then they recited the prescribed invocations, measuring each syllable on their tongues as though testing its weight. Only once the words had fallen correctly from their lips did they begin to assign torchbearers, patrician sponsors, and sacrificial victims to each festival. The organizers counted torches in multiples of 7 or 9, never forgetting to allot the spare one kept in readiness for unexpected ceremony. They cross-checked each name against previous year's rolls and ensured no individual appeared twice in overlapping processions. Their fingers moved with a meticulous slowness, calculating ranks, ensuring distances between marching contingents, and confirming that the number of dancers matched the required tally. When the plan was complete, it was sealed in a wax packet and delivered to the Pontifex Maximus, who would release the official proclamation at the proper hour. All of this took place away from public gaze, slate-gray walls echoing only the soft tap of stylus on wax and the measured hum of prayers. The organizers, having set their work in motion, vanished back into the alleys, leaving Rome's populace to assume that these grand festivals had emerged spontaneously from divine will, rather than meticulous human scheduling. Beneath the grand temples and the imposing altars, a more humble figure held a singular responsibility: the sacrificial knife sharpener. Before any suiviturilia, any hecatomb, any private libation requiring a blade, the knife itself had to be honed to a precise edge. The knife sharpener's workshop was modest. A bench carved from oak, a trough filled with water, and a long, flat whetstone. Each morning, he lit a small brazier to warm the stone, for a heated whetstone accepted the metal edge more willingly than a cold one. His tools were few: a bar of fine sand for abrasive cleaning, a small bottle of oil to lubricate the stone, and a rough cloth to remove filings. He began by inspecting the blade for chips, running his thumbnail along the edge to detect any imperfection. If a tiny flake of iron protruded, he placed the blade at an angle against the stone and drew it down in a single, deliberate motion. The process was slow. A dozen strokes on one side, a dozen on the other, alternating in measured succession until the knife hissed softly against the stone. Then he added a few drops of oil, resumed the sharpening to polish the edge, and finished with a section of leather bound to a short stick, stroking the blade in long, languid passes to remove burrs. Each pass was counted aloud. 1, 2, 1, 2, until the knife gleamed in the dim workshop light. When he judged the edge sufficiently acute, he wrapped it in oiled linen and placed it in a wooden box marked with the date and the occasion for which it had been prepared. He repeated this ritual for every blade, whether destined for the grandeur of the capital's sacrifices or the simple offerings laid at neighborhood shrines. The rhythmic rasp of metal on stone echoed against the walls, a monotonous symphony that governed each hour of his waking day. Despite the varied nature of their crafts, the ritualists of the unseen shared a common framework of repetition and secrecy. The haruspices spoke only in hushed tones, as if the very utterance of prophecy might disturb the omens. The augur observed in silence, both browsing the skies and browsing his own breath until the moment of declaration. Procession organizers worked behind closed doors, their dialogues a susurrus of styluses scratching wax. Knife sharpeners lingered in their little alcoves, worlds unto themselves, where only the hiss of steel broke the stillness. Their work intersected only at formal intersections. A magistrate might consult the augur and the haruspex before approving a procession, which in turn relied on a freshly prepared blade. Yet beneath these points of contact, each ritualist pursued the same methodical pace. Dawn to dusk, day in and day out, bolstering Rome's public life with unvarying devotion to the divine. These artisans found themselves bound to cycles older than memory. The haruspices recited formulas passed down from Etruria, the augurs traced grids that dated to Rome's mythic founders, the procession organizers upheld calendars inscribed by long-dead pontiffs, and the knife sharpeners used stones quarried from the same hillside as their forebears. None questioned the repetition, they embraced it. Each repetition affirmed Rome's continuity and assured the populace that the gods remained steadfastly attentive. Sometimes the ritualists exchanged brief greetings in hidden corridors. An augur returning from his templum might pause to nod at a procession organizer emerging from the atrium of Vesta's temple, and the two would share a single word, pax, meaning an auspicious calm, before moving on. Yet more often they passed like ghosts, unseen by the crowds that thronged the streets above and utterly unaware of the intricate ballet enacted beyond sight. When, occasionally, a ritual went awry, a flurry of birds failed to appear, a sheep's liver bore an ominous sign, a procession's torch count was misrecorded. The ritualist responsible recorded the anomaly and moved to correct it. The haruspex would perform an expiatory rite to cleanse the error, the augur would redo his sky watching at a fresh templum, the organizer would dispatch runners to adjust torch allocations, and the knife sharpener would resharpen a blade struck at the wrong angle. Each correction mirrored the original ritual in its precise repetition, as though the very restoration of order depended on the exact mimicry of the first attempt. These corrections offered the ritualists their rare moments of genuine excitement, an irregularity to break the flow, but soon enough, familiarity returned. They settled back into the slow rhythm of their tasks, the unvarying motions bringing a calm certainty that the city's sacred obligations would be met once more. In quieter moments, when their duties allowed brief respite, the ritualists reflected on the curious fellowship they shared. The haruspex, leaning against the worn fabric of his tent, would sketch crude diagrams of livers in the dirt, wondering if the augur overhead saw any promise in the seabirds wheeling above. The augur, walking back through the forum after a morning of readings, might recall the patterns scratched by candlelight and imagine them inscribed in the glow of lanterns used by knife sharpeners in distant alleyways. The procession organizer, balancing a torch to test its match, might ponder how the scent-laden offerings of perfumers drifted past the reliquary of the gods. The knife sharpener, polishing his stones by torchlight, sometimes felt the distant echoes of processional drums and could almost hear the chant of incense-bearers. Though they never gathered together, their imaginations intertwined, connecting them across the city's invisible networks of faith. As day surrendered to dusk, the ritualists completed their final acts. The haruspices extinguished their lamps in the tent and offered one last prayer of thanks. The augur swept the templum's boundaries, erasing footprints and reintegrating the earth. The procession organizers sealed their wax tablets and locked them in chests. The knife sharpener wrapped his stones in cloth and hung them from a hook above his bench. Then they retreated to modest homes or rented rooms, their minds heavy with portents and patterns, their bodies weary from the steady emphasis on repetition. In the quiet glow of evening, they allowed themselves a moment of rest. Yet even then, their thoughts drifted back to the liver's shine, the flight of birds, the cluster of torches, the sound of steel on stone. These images followed them into sleep, where they dreamed of the next dawn's rhythms. And so, The ritualists of the unseen maintained their vigil. Through the spinning of countless days and centuries, their unheralded efforts woven into the fabric of Rome's ascendancy. They offered structure to dreams, assurance to rulers, and the sense that even in uncertainty, the gods remained engaged. Each precise cut, each patient watch, each careful tally, and each measured stroke of the blade echoed with purpose. Their rituals, repeated to the point of trance, became a lullaby of order. Amid the city's restless pulse, as you drift through this tale, let the hushed chant of their prayers and the gentle cadence of their motions carry you into calm repose, confident that unseen guardians look ever upward and within, keeping watch over a world both seen and unseen. Chapter 4. Builders of the Mundane Marvels. In the slow awakening of ancient Rome's vast cityscape, there rose not only the clang of metal on stone and the voices of merchants hurrying to their stalls, but also a subtler symphony. The creak of wooden frames, the soft rasp of measuring cords pulled taut against the ground, the measured thump of timber stakes driven into dust. These sounds belong to the builders of the mundane marvels, craftsmen whose toil laid the invisible foundations of empire, while poets composed epic verses and generals plotted conquests. It was these laborers and technicians who transformed rugged terrain into straight roads and sloped aqueduct channels, whose patient hands carved mile markers and whose methodical tapping detected hidden leaks. Their work went uncelebrated in public squares, yet without their precision, Rome's aqueducts might have collapsed, its roads buckled, and its milestones failed to guide travelers safely along the empire's arteries. Each morning, before the sun's rays had finished gilding the tops of apartment blocks and temple columns, the surveying Groma-minders assembled in small groups at the edge of building sites. They arrived bearing their instruments. Wooden cross-shaped frames mounted atop short poles, weighted with thin plumb lines, all perfectly balanced. The Groma, as this device was called, looked simple enough, but its effectiveness depended on the surveyor's meticulous calibration. With slow, ritualized care, the Groma minder hammered the base pole into firm earth, ensuring its vertical alignment by observing the plumb-line stillness against the swirling breeze. Then, at each of the 4 cardinal points, he positioned a small stake, ducking to adjust the cross arm's angle by the slightest degree until the lines formed precise right angles. Apprentices watched with rapt attention, their own stakes scattered at measured distances, ready to be set in place once the master confirmed the alignment. The labor unfolded in minute increments. Tilt here, nudge there, hold still until the plumb bob stilled, repeat. Each step practiced so often that it had become a second nature. Day after day, season after season, the Groma-minders traced out the perfect lines that would guide legions and merchants alike, never straying from the same methodical routine. Once the initial survey had been completed, the task of road paving fell to the stampers, colloquially known as the basolarii. These artisans moved at dawn to the leveled course, where earth and gravel had already been laid out by laborers. The basolarii arrived with stacks of rectangular stone blocks, each quarried miles away and hauled to the site along rudimentary sledges or floated downriver on barges. With heavy wooden mallets in hand, the stampers positioned each block on the compacted gravel, tapped the corners until the stones sunk level with its neighbors, then lifted slightly to sprinkle fine sand beneath it before setting it back down. The process unfolded in a steady rhythm. Lift, sprinkle, lower, tap, adjust, then step back to admire the minute gap between the blocks. Never more than a finger's width. Apprentices carried small brushes to sweep away stray grains, ensuring that the joints remained narrow and uniform. The basolarii repeated this sequence across hundreds of paces, block after block, day after day, until the road gleamed as a smooth ribbon of stone. Travelers passing by might glimpse the slow choreography of mallet and chisel, hear the hollow thunk of each carefully placed block, but they rarely paused to ponder the countless hours invested in the perfect alignment of stones. Not far from the newly paved roads, artisans tasked with mile marker carving lent their skills to marking each Roman mile. These carvers worked with chisels and hammers in small open-air workshops, transforming rough marble cylinders into inscribed guideposts. The initial step involved rolling the cylindrical stone on a bed of sand, using long poles to keep it evenly balanced and ensure a uniform diameter. With the stone stabilized, the carver sketched letters and numbers in red ochre, counting each character meticulously and rubbing out smudges before beginning to chisel. The chiseling itself followed a strict ritual. Raise hammer, slightly tilt chisel, strike at a 20-degree angle, then pause to clear the flaked marble powder. Each stroke echoed in the quiet workshop as the letters emerged in crisp relief. Miles determined the numeral. For the first marker, I. For the second, 2, and so on. The carvers repeated the same gestures. Strike, clear, inspect, repeat, until every letter and numeral had been formed with uniform depth. Apprentices held small brushes to sweep away powder, then used damp sponges to smooth stray roughness. When the inscription satisfied the carver's exacting eye, he rubbed a thin wash of diluted lime over the lettering, allowing it to seep into the grooves and make the chiseled characters stand out against the pale marble. Finally, the finished marker was hoisted onto a simple stone base, ready to be installed along the roadside, where travelers could glance at its familiar form and know, to the pace of their sandals, how far they had come. While roads and milestones claimed much of Rome's overland attention, another network pulsed above and below the earth: the aqueducts. Vast channels carried cool spring water into the city's fountains, baths, and private estates, yet maintaining their steady flow required constant vigilance. The aquarii explorators, leak seekers, rose with the first light to patrol the shallow channels of stone that snaked along the countryside. Armed with wooden poles, small mallets, and jars of chalk powder, they followed the narrow waterways step by slow step. At intervals of a few paces, a seeker would tap the stone channel wall with his mallet, listening intently for a hollow ring indicating a gap or fracture. If he detected a suspect spot, he would sprinkle chalk powder into the crack and note its spread. Then he would lean close, tilting his ear to the water's gentle ripple, and compare the sound to his mental catalog of healthy channels. Each tapping, each sniff of the musty stone, each careful sprinkle of powder formed part of a methodical routine that repeated across dozens of miles of aqueduct. A single leak, left unattended, could divert precious water away from public fountains or disrupt the balance of water pressure, leading to catastrophic blockages. Thus the explorators maintained their vigilance day in and day out, patrolling the sinuous lines with a steady, unhurried pace, marking any defect in small leather-bound notebooks, and reporting back to the overseer's office for repair crews to be dispatched. The repair crews, in turn, relied on the explorators' precise notations. They arrived with chisels, damp clay, and tightly woven linen cloths to patch fractures. The menders first cleared loose debris by tapping the edges of the crack, then applied wet clay mixed with lime to seal the gap. With broad trowels fashioned from sharpened wood, they smoothed the patch flush to the surrounding channel surface, then bound it in place with strips of cloth soaked in a sticky resin. Each patch followed the same slow, deliberate sequence. Clear, apply, smooth, bind, and allow a day of hardening. Only after repeated inspections by the explorators would the aqueduct be declared fit and the channel's water flow restored to its accustomed rhythm. In quieter quarters of the city, stonemasons' assistants bore the artifacts of ancient construction. Fragments of broken paving, chipped offcuts from monumental carvings, and the occasional column drum rejected for minor imperfections. These offcuts were gathered in heaps behind workshops, then repurposed to fill gaps in embankments or to provide foundational support beneath heavier stones. The assistants moved them by lifting small chunks onto their shoulders, stacking them like oversized building blocks. Each placement required a brief pause to tap the new stone with a small mallet, ensuring it settled snugly against its neighbor. Over time, these improvised structures acquired a patina of collective neglect, yet their solidity testified to the unending cycle of reuse that defined Roman practicality. The assistants repeated their labor until the piles of offcuts were completely integrated into the city's hidden substructure, cemented by time and the compacted layers of earth. Above, as midday sun settled onto clay and marble, the surveyors and masons alike paused to share simple meals of barley porridge and dried figs. The meals themselves offered a momentary relief from the unceasing repetition of stone and mortar. Surveyors cleaned their groma lines with sponges dipped in vinegar, masons wiped sweat from their brows with coarse linen towels, and all reflected on the imperceptible changes in their work. A slightly wobbling plumb line, a block that required just one extra tap, a crack imperceptible to the untrained eye. These nuances, noted with a specialist's care, rippled through the cycle of construction and maintenance, ensuring that each adjustment, though minute, preserved the seamless order of roads, markers, and aqueducts. By the afternoon, the sun had edged westward, casting long shadows across the nearly completed stretches of paved roadway. Travelers and couriers found the fresh stones smooth against their sandals, their carriage wheels rolling with predictable ease. They glimpsed the mile markers standing like silent sentinels, their bold numerals catching the sunlight. They might pass towering aqueduct arches above them, unaware that, just beneath the stones, explorators had recently traced the channel. For leaks and repair crews had sealed minor fissures. None of this appeared in lavish public spectacles or grand commemorative arches. The labor remained invisible, embedded in every step and every drop of water that echoed through the city. As dusk approached, the surveyors returned their grommet to racks in quiet storage rooms, where future generations would pick them up again to lay out yet more roads or erect new buildings. The basolarii stacked their mallets and stones, leaving behind a ribbon of perfectly fitted paving that would outlast their own lifetimes. Carvers unmounted their chisels from the ribs of completed milestone cylinders, and explorers stowed their poles, mallets, and chalk in small leather pouches. Even the assistants who had woven abandoned offcuts into foundations paused to admire the solidity of their work before trudging home. In the dimming light, these builders of the mundane marvels crossed paths in narrow lanes, offering nods rather than words. Their shared understanding lay in the knowledge that Rome's greatness rested not on the visible monuments alone, but equally on the hidden networks of precision and maintenance that undergirded every structure. They walked the same cobbles they had placed, soaked in the same aqueduct water they had helped preserve, guided by the same milestones they had carved. Their tasks, repeated without variation each day, formed the steady heartbeat of an empire that stretched from ocean to ocean. And though history's chroniclers focused on triumphs of conquest and the splendor of marble halls, the builders of the mundane marvels quietly ensured that Rome endured, its roads unfaltering, its water pure, and its travelers ever guided by stones placed with unerring exactitude. As you surrender to the steady rhythm of these accounts, imagine the surveying lines pulled taut against a sunlit sky, the measured clink of chisel on marble, the soft dust rising from freshly set paving stones, and the distant trill of water flowing through stone channels. Let these images blend into a slow, lulling pulse, each repetition a gentle invitation to drift deeper into repose. Know that in the shadows of history's grandest stories, these humble craftsmen laid the groundwork for all that followed, their deliberate motions a tranquil mantra beneath the din of empire. May the memory of their unheralded toil carry you into a restful slumber, assured that the mundane marvels of Rome rest upon hands guided by precision, patience, and unshakable routine. Chapter 5. Entertainers of the Eccentric. In the vast tapestry of ancient Rome's entertainments, where chariots thundered in the Circus Maximus and gladiators clashed beneath the vaulted arenas, there existed a subtler, quieter class of performers whose work brimmed with oddity. These entertainers of the eccentric toiled in the margins of public spectacle, providing interludes of novelty for those seeking variety from the grand pageantry of imperial games. Their days unfolded in humble training yards, tucked away quaysides, and narrow streets where curious onlookers gathered in small clusters. They devoted themselves to tasks at once whimsical and repetitive, reenacting sea battles in flooded arenas, coaxing unruly ostriches through simple routines, testing the endurance of oil lamps by the hour, and learning the delicate art of balancing on stilts while flinging leaden balls. Each pursuit measured out in incremental motions repeated until ingrained. Their presence in Rome was neither heralded in poems nor carved in stone, yet they offered amusements that lingered across dinner conversations and the slow march of everyday chatter. And so they went about their singular labors, weaving eccentric lullabies of routine that rippled beneath the roar of grand spectacles. Before the sun had fully emerged above the Tiber's fogged waters, the Naumachii, those specialists in orchestrating mock naval battles, assembled along quays deliberately flooded for their purpose. The excavation and refilling of an amphitheater basin was itself a spectacle of engineering, but for the Naumachii it was a prelude to routine. Each morning they returned to inspect the depth of water, marking the surface with small wooden stakes that showed exact inches. They measured the distance between floating platforms, ensuring each remained equidistant, a task requiring repeated sighting with slender rods. Once satisfied, they gathered their cohorts. Prisoners granted a reprieve from gallows in exchange for repeated immersion in cold water. The Naumachii led the men through choreographed drills. Oars dipped in unison, shields aligned at stern, swords clanged in monotone rhythms. They practiced these drills for hours before the crowd gathered, their commands delivered. In low, measured tones, the water lapped against the stone walls in soft, repetitive splashes, echoing the steady beat of or against hull. The men acting as galley slaves heaved weighted oars, then rested, then heaved again over and over, orchestrated by the Naumachii who counted each stroke. The trainer's voice remained calm and even, calling out the count. 1, 2, 1, 2, until muscle memory took over and the thrumming cadence became internalized. By the time timid onlookers arrived, the contestants were primed, their motions unhesitating and uniform. The ensuing spectacle, gladiatorial-style duels between tiny vessels, unfolded with minimal variation from previous reenactments, but for Romans, accustomed to the same actors and the same dialogue, it provided just enough novelty to draw a lullaby-like fascination. Elsewhere in the city, on dusty training grounds fringed by low walls, the Struthianarii Roman ostrich trainers, engaged in a labor equally bizarre yet just as methodical. These trainers coaxed powerful, flightless birds through choreographed routines that amounted to a strange ballet on two towering legs. Each morning they arrived with small sacks of sorghum grain and tough leather whips, their hands thick with calluses from years of gripping rough straps. The ostriches, housed in sandy pens, edged by masonry, heaved themselves upright at the trainer's calls, their feathers rustling in a staccato whisper. The trainers guided them in simple patterns. A loop around a central mast, a swift lateral sidestep, a backward hop onto their haunches, and then a pivot as fluid as a dancer's turn. Each movement was drilled with unrelenting repetition. Loop, sidestep, hop, pivot, loop, sidestep, hop, pivot. The trainers carried long rods topped with painted arrows to set the bird's direction, twisting them with a precise flick of the wrist. They repeated this flick countless times, beginning with wide, sweeping arcs and gradually tightening the radius until the ostrich learned to follow the arrow's guidance without hesitation. Behind each arrow twist lay small rewards of grain, tossed gently into the bird's beak, followed by swift taps on the leg with the leather whip, never harsh but enough to redirect attention. By midday, the trainers counted each completed circuit, tallying them on strips of parchment. 37 loops precisely. One trainer would note in a quiet scrawl, then reset the count and begin anew. Over the course of an hour, an ostrich might circle a central post hundreds of times, its legs blurring into vertical columns, its breath steady and measured, and as the sun faded, the Struthionarius gathered his exhausted avian troop, locking each back into its stall, with the same ritual fastening of leather straps and careful sealing of the gate latch. Each return to the pen marked the end of one day's repetition, though the promise of tomorrow's loops and pivots ensured that the cycle would persist unchanged. In the flickering half-light of night, another set of laborers called upon far more modest tools to ensure Rome's evening hours glowed with reliable illumination. These were the lamp testers, men entrusted with quality control of every oil lamp destined for both public venues and private parlors. Their work commenced deep within the shadowy halls of an imperial warehouse, beneath vaulted ceilings lined with shelves heavy with unglazed lamps of clay and bronze. The testers organized there, stations in neat rows, each furnished with a shallow basin of clean water, dozens of identical wicks, and a bucket of runny olive oil. At the stroke of dusk, they gathered each lamp, lit its wick from a single communal flame, and noted the time on small sundials adapted for indoor use. Then they arranged the lamps on low wooden benches, their naked flames flickering against the stone floor. The testers moved from lamp to lamp in measured progression, adjusting each wick's height by the slightest millimeter to maintain a consistent flame height. They tilted the lamp bodies, listening for a soft hiss that indicated a proper air-fuel mixture. If the hiss failed to emerge, they snuffed the lamp, refilled it, and repeated the lighting process without haste. Every hour, they returned to each station, checked the flame's steadiness, topped up the oil reservoir, and dabbed away any blackened residue clinging to the lamp spout. They recorded their observations on wax tablets. Lamp 12, extinguished at second hour, relit, sufficed for 6 more hours. Then they wiped the tablets clean, re-etched the same observations, and stored them for reference. Over the course of the night, as lamps burned in symposium-filled atria and long corridors of insomniac scholars, the lamp testers repeated these checks dozens of times, their motions punctuated by the soft click of tablets being reset and the faint warm glow of identical flames reflected in water-filled basins. When dawn approached, they unlit the final lamps, allowed the wicks to cool, and laid them on racks to dry, all the while cataloging their findings in neat, looping script. And then, as the sun's first rays filtered through latticed windows, the testers retired homewards, confident that the city's twilight hours had been counted and calibrated in a ritual of unending routine. On the quieter streets of Rome, beneath the arches that spanned narrow lanes, another breed of performer practiced a craft both demanding and understated: the stilt walking street jugglers. These entertainers mounted tall wooden stilts forged by local carpenters and honed to smooth cylinders by Herculean sanding. The stilts extended nearly 3 feet above the ground, requiring the jugglers to spend long days adjusting their centers of gravity, learning to shift weight from one leg pole to the other with barely a ripple. Each morning, they strapped their feet into leather bindings fastened tightly to the stilts with buckles that had to be overlapped by exactly half an inch, ensuring uniform tension. With wooden balls, heaviened by lead cores, they began simple tosses. One ball launched in a gentle arc, caught and tossed again. Each throw required a precise upward push of the wrist, timed with a slight hop on the stilts to maintain balance. The juggling counted progressed. Methodically, 5 successful catches in succession before advancing to 6, then 7, always resetting the count after a dropped ball. They practiced these sequences on dusty patches beside the forum, where passers-by paused to gape at their high-stepped figures and rhythmic arcs of leaden spheres. Their motions remained consistent: toss, catch, hop, toss, catch, hop, until muscle memory suffused every action. When the crowd swelled, the jugglers lengthened their routines to include passing balls behind their backs and between stilts, each variation rehearsed for hours in private courtyards. Each rehearsal followed the same pattern: tie on stilts, warm up ankles, toss 5 times, rest, toss 10 times, rest, tie off stilts, record progress on parchment. And when the performances began at dusk, they repeated the practiced routines exactly, never deviating, their steadied motions providing a curious hush amid the city's bustle. Across these varied entertainments, see battle reenactments, ostrich ballets, lamp endurance trials, and stilt juggling, one discerns a common thread of repetitive precision. Each performer, regardless of the nature of their craft, embraced an unvarying cycle: arrive, prepare tools, rehearse motions, record outcomes, repeat. The novelty of their spectacle lay not in unpredictability, but in the subtle adjustments they introduced to stave off boredom. A slightly fresher plume on an ostrich's head, an incremental increase in lamp wick length, the addition of a 5th ball to a juggling sequence, or a tighter turn in a galley's formation. Yet fundamentally, the rhythm of their days remained intact, their hands and bodies conditioned to the same repertory of movements. They spoke little during rehearsals, for their focus required quiet. When words did emerge, it was in measured counts or gentle encouragement: audio, dare yourself, iterum, again, stabilis, steady. Through these brief exhortations, they reinforced the link between mind and muscle, each utterance mirroring the dulcet hush of their motions. In the aftermath of performances, the entertainers gathered in shared backrooms or courtyards, laying out tools and props for inspection. The Naumachyarii drained residual water from flooded arenas and res-tacked oars with identical spacing. The ostrich trainers cleaned arrows and reapplied colored fletching, counting each arrow twice before storage. Lamp testers refilled oil jugs, replaced wicks, and wiped basins of water dry. Stilt jugglers oiled leather straps, inspected stilts for cracks, and aligned buckles to exact specifications. In each case, the cleanup mirrored the setup in miniature, a final repetition of the day's cycle. The ritual of closing down their implements provided a gentle denouement, a soft descent from the heights, literal or figurative, of their performances. And as they parted for the night, they unwound by discussing minor adjustments. A change of oil blend for the lamps, a different angle for owl calls to hush the ostriches, a new foot binding for the stilts, or a trimmed hull edge for the mock ships. These conversations, deliberate and unhurried, formed the foundation for tomorrow's rehearsals, ensuring that the cycle of preparation, enactment, and reflection continued uninterrupted. Across Rome, from the grandest amphitheaters to the humblest side streets, the entertainments of the eccentric wove a nocturnal counterpoint to the city's daytime grandeur. For every chariot race that thundered in the morning sun, a Naumachia rumbled in a flooded ring by night. As senators quibbled over politics in marble chambers, ostrich trainers orchestrated silent conga lines of long-necked birds on dusty grounds, while scholars burned midnight oil in private libraries. Lamp testers calibrated the glow that sustained their studies. And as feverish crowds watched gladiators slaughter one another in arenas, stilt jugglers lofted leaden spheres high above narrow lanes and practiced arcs. Each spectacle adhered to a slow, meticulous rhythm, and each repetition carried the entertainers deeper into the muscle memory of their peculiar crafts. If one listens closely, one might hear in these routines a soft undertone. The hush of oars on still water, the rustle of feathers in sand, the gentle hiss of oil against wick, the muted thud of stones beneath stilts. These are the lullabies of eccentric labor, punctuated by the faintest applause or the occasional murmur of surprise from onlookers. Yet for the entertainers themselves, the applause mattered little compared to the unbroken sequence of rehearsals and performances. Their satisfaction lay in mastering each incremental motion, in calibrating each loop and each toss, in fine-tuning the subtle differences that distinguished a sleepy delight from open boredom. Through their uncelebrated diligence, they sustained Rome's hunger for novelty, offering diversions that wove into the city's nocturnal tapestry. And so, as you prepare to drift into slumber, imagine the gentle rocking of mock ships in shallow water, the soft patter of ostrich feet on sunlit sand, the flickering glow of lamps tested by attentive hands, and the careful hop of a juggler high above the street. Let these images swirl in your mind like a gentle carousel of oddity, each repetition a step further into the realm of sleep. For within the curious labors of these entertainers of the eccentric lies a rhythmic comfort, a reminder that even in the grandest of cities, it is the unassuming routines, the repeated loops, the measured counts, the silent consistency, that sustain the fabric of daily life and guide the weary into restful repose.